Hey folks, I'm Alex Dowd.
And I'm Katie Rife.
Black Widow, starring Scarlett Johansson as reformed assassin Natasha Romanoff, hits theaters and Disney Plus today. In honor of its release, we're talking about the Uber franchise it continues, the biggest series in the history of movies, the Marvel Cinematic Universe. We'll get into the current state of that ongoing comic book crossover event, as well as the highs and lows it's offered so far, with the help of a special guest.
Welcome to Film Club.
Okay, Katie, so you and I have been doing this show for a little while now, and I feel like we do not to toot our own horns here, so to speak, but I feel like we do an okay job of kind of switching it up and talking about, one could say, high and low culture. We talk about indie movies sometimes. We talk about blockbusters. This week, we're going to be talking about what you could call the monoculture, and sort of one would say, the biggest, maybe the biggest form of entertainment in the world today. Wouldn't you say? I
mean, it is the highest grossing movie franchise of all time, right?
Yes, which, although I have to say, they kind of get by on the fact that, and obviously this is something we're going to talk about more today, they kind of do get by a little bit on the fact that they have this whole shared universe plan, which means that it's not simply one franchise within the Marvel Cinematic Universe, it's multiple running franchises. So you get to add up like 24 movies, you know?
Still, though, I mean, you're right that every single one of these movies is a big cultural event.
Yep.
Even if it's not really, your thing, it's very difficult to avoid. And, I would say that even just like a kind of, this is obviously not a scientific metric, but I would say I see more people just out on the street wearing like t-shirts with Marvel characters on them than I see any other kind of character or branding or franchise anymore. Used to be Star Wars more, but now it's mostly Marvel that you just see out in the wild.
I just think it dominates so much of the box office every year and so much of the general public's. I mean, for one thing, there's so many of these come out even in a year, and again, we're going to talk more about that. There's actually 4 on the docket for this year alone, playing catch up. But there are years even before, obviously before COVID and the pandemic, where there were 3 coming out in a year. They are just a dominant cultural force at this time, and which I have complicated feelings about, I guess I would say. And maybe we'll talk about that too. But before we go any further,
I was going to say that I feel that I should give our listeners full disclosure up top. My philosophy is that there are lots of Marvel experts in the world, so I don't need to be one. So I am coming at this from a place of, I'm not the biggest fan of the franchise. However, it is not my way to yuck other people's yum. So with that in mind, let's bring on our special guest who is a big fan of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Doing the work that I do not. It's Alex McLevy.
Hey guys, what's up? Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming on, man.
Yeah, my pleasure. I'm here to yum.
Listeners may recall that, regular readers of the site may recall Alex from his regular contributions to the site. He is a staff writer for us. He also he often is on the superhero beat, writing reactive pieces about what's new in comic book cinema, which is, again, such a dominant force in what we are forced to write about. And Alex is also our music editor. And he has been on the show before. He was on earlier this year, and we were talking about Marvel's crosstown rivals, DC, and we were talking about the DC cinematic universe and what worked and doesn't work about those films. And we're happy to have you back to talk about the other side of the comic book industrial complex.
Yes,
yeah, it's nice to be back for other, as you say, the other half that will actually get slightly more praise than I'm sure what pleased every single DC fan to no end when we discussed Zack Snyder's output in the DCEU.
Yeah, I mean, listeners should know, of course, up front that our the checks haven't cleared yet, but Marvel has, of course, paid in full for this episode, where we're just going to basically slobber over these movies for an hour. So I hope you enjoy that.
If you're listening and you're not sure what Dowd is referring to, there is a long-standing sort of internet conspiracy theory that critics get paid to write positive things about Marvel movies and negative things about DC movies. So, I mean, I stopped watching them because my checks weren't clearing. Personally,
I will still make the case. Disney, if you're listening, Mouse Daddy, I would shill so good for you. I'll tell you where to send the checks.
The Disney umbrella is so big now that, even though Marvel isn't necessarily my thing, I recap The Mandalorian for AV Club, and I definitely effuse over that series sometimes. So everybody's got their thing.
Yeah, I mean, we're moving. One of my great fears, the things that keeps me up at night as a film critic anyway, is that one day Disney is going to own everything. And, when you want to talk about monoculture, I really feel like we're moving in that direction with how Disney has snatched up so much of the available intellectual property out there and so much sort of absorbing other companies as well. And I don't think that's a great thing in a lot of respects. And
well, it can be a real problem. Like, for example, there was a time a few years ago, you'll remember this, Dowd, when Disney effectively blacklisted the LA Times from attending Disney film screenings because they had written critical articles about Disney's business practices in relation to Disneyland.
Yep. And if you think about that, I mean, like, one of the reasons that was rolled back was that a number of publications came forward and said, we will not be attending press screenings until the LA Times can as well. A sort of show of solidarity, essentially. And that worked, I think, because Disney didn't want the bad press. But if you are the only game in town, I don't really know if bad press is that big of a deal to you.
Yeah.
That's my fear.
It puts you in the uncomfortable position of sort of having to sometimes support other large evil corporations just because they're not Disney. You know what I mean? When Amazon, for example, snapped up the rights to the Lord of the Rings and stuff, you sort of say, okay, well, at least somebody's putting up a fight, but I'm not sure I want that to be the guy I'm backing against Disney either.
Yeah, Amazon is arguably just as bad, if not worse, because their tendrils reach farther.
Yeah, you just find yourself sort of, having to, like, in a lot of these internecine warfare between giant corporations, sort of having to go with the best of two or more bad options.
That's the dystopian future. Is that what are we all just cheerleading for one giant corporation over another or something?
Anyway, back to Ready Player 3.
Well, actually, back to Marvel movies, which again are a big part of the machine that we're talking about, and happy to be contributing to that, I guess. I don't know. I mean, the fact of the matter is they are a big part of the cultural conversation, and they are mass entertainments that a number of people watch and have opinions about. But the last 2 years, we have kind of seen, for obvious reasons, we've seen a sort of absence of Marvel movies. There was one scheduled, obviously, the one that we are going to be talking this week on a bonus episode, Black Widow, was scheduled to open in May of last year, May of 2020. And, then obviously the COVID pandemic happened and Marvel scuttled its plans, sort of pushing back its entire calendar of releases. So we went from the summer of 2019 until right now without a Marvel movie. Not a long time in the grand scheme of things, but in the timeline of a franchise that has been a consistent box office presence for the last 13 years, a significant absence, I would say.
I think it really says a lot about Marvel's place in the film industry and how big it really is that it was never even really considered that they might put these movies straight to streaming.
Right. Black Widow, of course, is going to be available on Disney Plus for a premium price, which is something Disney has done before with some of its animated properties. I believe Pixar's Soul was available for extra cost to subscribers. Mulan as well. But it's also going to be in theaters, and I just don't think that Marvel. I think Marvel was waiting, even as they kind of hedged their bets here and released Black Widow onto their streaming service as well. I think that Disney has essentially said, I think we wanted to wait until we could make some money on this in theaters as well. How do we think it's going to do in theaters?
I mean, I honestly, based on just the last couple weeks of how the Fast and Furious latest edition of that performed, I think it's going to do gangbusters.
Yeah.
Yeah, I could see it doing quite well, and I don't think that the premium streaming is going to hurt it that much because Godzilla vs. Kong and Mortal Kombat also did quite well in theaters earlier in the year when fewer people were comfortable going to the theater.
Very true.
I think this one
Yeah, going back to the movie theaters is still, I think, such an exciting proposition for a lot of people, especially as well. Still, that it's gonna capitalize on that, which I think also, Fast 9 also benefited from.
Yeah, I'm willing to bet that there are people who have actually waited until this point to go. I mean, I'm sure that both of you share this experience, but there are people I know in my life who go to the movies maybe 3 or 4 times a year, and
if that,
right. And it's almost always to a major event, a major 4-quadrant, stop the presses, cultural conversation, water cooler event, like a Marvel movie. And I just feel like with Black Widow out there, I think that some people might break their own embargo on going to the movies to go see this film. I'm not sure, though.
I mean, this is a kind of a different topic, but I think it's really interesting that the past month and a half of releases has been this series of carrots and sticks. Like, are you ready for In the Heights? No, not yet. F9? Huh? Black Widow? Huh? Like, they keep upping the stakes.
Yeah.
Yeah, very much so. And also, it's important to remember that, as opposed to some of the other upcoming Marvel movies from this year, Shang-Chi and The Legend of the Ten Rings, Eternals, both coming out later, Black Widow has, 10 years of audience goodwill built up for that character, which I think is also going to play enormously into its attendance.
Yeah, I mean, this was a movie that... we're going to talk about this more on another episode this week. If you're listening and you'd like to hear more about Black Widow, we do have a full bonus episode on that this week, so check that out. But just in terms of the backstory behind Black Widow, this is a movie that fans have been clamoring for a long time. Kevin Feige was oddly resistant to greenlighting it at a certain point. I'm not sure exactly what numbers he was looking at, or if that was just good old-fashioned institutional sexism. But
yeah, that's a big factor in the whole conversation of how long it took to get a Black Widow movie and all this sort of thing. I mean, this is the first one to be solo directed by a woman. Captain Marvel was co-directed by a woman, but that film had 2 directors.
Totally. So we should mention, too, that, again, Alex sort of mentioned this already, but this is one of 4 Marvel movies that's actually scheduled to open in theaters this year. Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings comes out in September, Eternals in November, and then Spider-Man Far From Home is currently scheduled to drop in December. Marvel really making up for lost time there, saying, we're going to get you 4 of these this year. In fact, in the span of about 6 months. I myself found myself feeling over the last few years a degree of fatigue with these movies. And I'm not sure packing 4 into a half of a year is going to change that. I will say that not having had one of these for essentially 2 years did make me a little bit more...
excited?
Yeah, excited might be the wrong word. A little bit more susceptible to the charms, maybe, of one of them.
Welcoming of it.
Yeah, I felt a little less burnout for once.
Yeah. Well, and I'm thinking about that too, because they've started launching all these Marvel TV series on Disney Plus, and you went from a drought to a flood because there was WandaVision earlier this year, Loki right now, and now the movies are all coming out. I mean, there is just a tidal wave of Marvel coming.
That's the thing.
Till the end of the year.
That's the thing. I mean, even the notion that Marvel ever really disappeared, the idea that we didn't have Marvel in our life, I mean, at least this year, it has come roaring back in a big way, on both the small and the big screen. So let's just for the I'm going to say maybe the 2 people in the world who might be listening to this that don't know the history of the MCU. Just a very quick overview on that. These movies have been going since 2008. That's when Marvel sort of decided to try to make a franchise out of the superheroes it hadn't already sold to other studios. So, their big headliners: Spider-Man, the X-Men. Those characters were basically in the hands of other studios at that point. So Marvel said, well, who do we have left and what can we do with them? And somebody came up with the idea that we are going to try to do something akin to what we've been doing for decades in the comics, which is build this kind of interconnected universe. So instead of the standard sequel, here's a superhero, he might return for part 2 if this thing remains profitable, he might return for another one after that. basically, it's building this whole cinematic universe where characters have their own franchises, but they also cross over in larger movies.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right that that's been a thing in comic books for a very long time. But I always like to point out that Toho did this with its kaiju movies back in the 60s. Godzilla is an interconnected universe.
And even before that, Universal did it with its monsters in the 30s.
That's right.
I mean, we had, Dracula and Frankenstein were running around together for a while there, long before, really, honestly, even before comic books were entirely doing that,
Yeah, and it's always sort of, even during the times when it's gone away, it sort of existed on the fringes, often in genre stuff, when you had the Freddy vs. Jason crossover, you have things like that where they, it's Alien vs. Predator. These things, still happened in those intervening years. They were just infrequent.
I think it speaks to one of the essential joys of nerddom, which is arguing about whether your favorite character could beat up somebody else's favorite character. That's one of the pillars of being a nerd.
Totally, it's like the scene in Stand By Me when they're sitting around the fire and they're talking about who would win in a fight between Superman and Mighty Mouse. Yeah. That is sort of the maybe the core appeal of these movies in some respects is that we always want to be sort of slamming our action figures together as kids or oversized kids. Marvel, I would say, it has pulled this strategy off in a way that nobody had before and nobody really has since, honestly. The shared universe plan really worked for them. The first movie was obviously Iron Man in 2008, which was a huge hit. But that same summer, they also came out with The Incredible Hulk, proof that right there from the beginning, they were already thinking about, we're building something here. These are not just individual films. They're building to something. And I felt like for the first few years, Iron Man aside, these movies were not necessarily enormous smashes, but they all fed into something larger that became this huge thing. I mean, like the Hulk movie as well as the first Thor film, the first Captain America film, all of those were kind of like modest hits, basically. But they laid the groundwork for the Avengers. And I feel like as a business strategy, it's hard not to have some degree of awe for this, even if it skeeves you out in other ways. I mean, to just look at them pulling off this gambit of saying that we are going to plan many, many years in advance and build films that all kind of feed into the same hub, if that makes sense.
So you're watching a James Bond movie right now and begrudgingly acknowledging that, yeah, that island is pretty cool. The supervillain island that they built.
Totally. One thing that I find really funny, though, is that it's interesting to me that these movies began with Iron Man, and that the whole infrastructure of this franchise and its tone, I feel like its kind of comic approach to these characters, its sort of character forward approach, all comes down to a movie that went into production without even a final script. I mean, there was a very sort of probably a nerve-wrackingly improvisational nature to the way that Iron Man was put together, and it's just interesting to me that is the film that all of these other films are built on.
Yeah. I mean, you sort of, that is the one thing that I think there is to sort of admire from a purely sort of almost entrepreneurial sense with Marvel, is they really staked everything on this movie that, as you say, went into production without a final script, was based on an extremely, historically volatile leading man who for a few years there prior to it couldn't really get arrested in Hollywood, right. In Robert Downey Jr. And all these things just sort of came together and they really, sort of struck gold, I should say. In a way that I don't think even they themselves necessarily expected.
No, it definitely felt like a sort of a happy accident of a major smash in some ways, that they were kind of just feeling their way through it. But I mean, the qualities that were there central to it, and which I have to assume probably made some suits at Marvel kind of nervous, including that sort of improvisational quality to some of the dialogue, would become so central to what this franchise is about in terms of how it approaches these characters in this world. The tone of Marvel movies, which a lot of I feel like a lot of blockbusters have tried to reproduce in the years since, it all goes back to Iron Man, right?
Oh, yeah. Very much so. Yeah, and you even see that with some of their later films. Like one of the things that Iron Man bought them is with its enormous success is sort of the ability to be patient with some of its other sort of equally tertiary characters. You know, as you mentioned, you know, Thor when it first came out, the first Captain America. I mean, these weren't necessarily monster hits. They did well, but they weren't these sort of giant smashes. And that sort of success of Iron Man bought them the ability to be patient with that and say, it's okay. They're going to become parts of the Avengers, and then they're going to become giant successes in their own right. I mean, you see that with something as late as Ant-Man, not until 2015, which that first Ant-Man was barely a success.
Right, not a huge hit for them.
Yeah, and yet they knew, you know, this guy is going to come into play. He's going to be integrated into the larger Avengers stories, and therefore, you know, you come back with the second Ant-Man, and I think it did something like triple or quadruple its box office.
So how do you well, I have kind of some trouble believing that Marvel ever took a throw things at the wall and see what sticks kind of strategy, considering, like you're talking about, they do have this grander plan of how the characters are going to come back in. I kind of have trouble believing that there was ever anything improvisational about this.
It's interesting because I think that in a macro sense, they had a very clear idea of what they wanted to do here. They were like, we will do 4 movies and then we'll do a crossover one. In a micro sense, I really don't think anybody was being as watchful, at least of that first film, as you'd think necessarily. Because the story's about that first movie, and maybe that's just mythology that's gotten out of hand, but it did supposedly go into production without a final script. And, I mean, if you look at the film, you can kind of see a movie that... I actually think Iron Man is one of the stronger films in this series to this day, honestly. But it is definitely a movie that feels looser than some of the ones that would come later. In a way that I think Marvel's... One of the things that happened is that Marvel's success allowed them to tighten the reins in a very real way. And they said, we'll bring filmmakers on board, but now we have a formula. Now we know what works here. So now you sort of do have to color within the lines, you know?
And, you know, when you look at Iron Man, that first one, too, sure, it's definitely got lots of visual effects in it. But it's not the same as, like, a later Avengers movie where the last 30 minutes of it are basically computer animated. Right. It's not the scale of the effects isn't as grand in that movie, I suppose.
That's very true. It's more down to earth than a lot of the ones that would both literally and figuratively down to earth than a lot of what would come afterwards. It's also funny to me how much this, in a very Marvel way, how much this franchise has kept piling more crazy fantasy sci-fi nonsense on top of itself over the years. At that first one, you're like, here's a guy who builds a super suit. That's the buy-in for audiences. Yeah. By Thor, a few years later, there are gods in space. You know, that's the leap there, you know?
Sure. And then you have, like, super soldiers and, everything else that comes into it.
Yeah, and that's part of the brilliance, I think, of that first Avengers movie, too, is, you know, that was the movie that sort of needed to integrate all these things and strike this tone where the sort of grounded realism of Iron Man, which is just a rich guy in a suit, could be, you know, successfully paired alongside, an Asgardian god. And it managed to do so in a way that sort of acknowledged the ridiculousness of that, but still took it seriously. And I think that was another step, I think, akin to Iron Man, where that was the next big gamble where they said, will this universe work? And once the Avengers hit, that was when they knew, I think they really had something that was going to go the distance.
Very much so.
I think that is one of the strengths of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, from my perspective, is that it does encompass all these different types of sci-fi and fantasy storylines. Like, for example, you also have Doctor Strange, where you bring in more of like a psychedelic, magic and wizardry type of fantasy, which appeals to me personally, you know. And then you also have, like Adventures in Space, Guardians of the Galaxy, and all this other stuff.
Yeah, what Marvel has kind of successfully been able to do is they've made themselves into a trusted cinematic brand for a lot of people. It's why these movies are almost... I remember when Guardians of the Galaxy was coming out, those characters before those movies were second stringers at best in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. These were not characters in the Marvel comic book universe. These were not characters that a lot of people who... Certainly no one who didn't read comics knew about these characters. They had never showed up in movies before, and they were not household names. But the fact that it was a Marvel movie I think automatically got people in the seats. So Marvel is now at a point, and I think they got there over the years, where they can basically having Marvel above the title is going to get people there, so that they can theoretically play around a little bit and at the very least muck around in other genres. And yeah, they can do a space opera. They can do sort of sci-fi Shakespeare. They can do a spy movie, as in the most recent film, obviously. And the reason they're able to do that is that people now just simply, if it says Marvel, they're going to buy a ticket.
Now, do you think that's just successful branding, or do you think that there's also, because earlier we were talking about basing the sort of structure of it off of something that they do in comic books with crossovers. Do you think that there's something in the storytelling that makes people give it that trust, or is it just that they're very good at branding?
No, I mean, I think it's 100% related also to what you're talking about in terms of the storytelling, which is so it's so episodic, and basically audiences realizing early on that if they went and saw an Incredible Hulk movie, they might get Iron Man 2, I think has affected people's interest in these films as well, because the fact of the matter is you end up feeling like, I mean, if you grew up reading comic books, you understood this with sort of innately, and certainly with crossover events. But in order to get the full story, you often had to buy a bunch of different issues. You would be like, well, in order to know what they're talking about here, I also have to go buy that Spider-Man comic or that issue of Wolverine or something to get the full picture. I think that Marvel has been able to successfully put that idea into people's heads in terms of their movies, so that when they go see Doctor Strange, they feel like they're seeing a piece of something larger that if they miss, they wouldn't necessarily understand what comes after it.
Yeah,
Totally.
and as long as it maintained, I think, a sort of steady pace, and we can talk about this a bit later on in this episode, but as long as it maintained a pace where, as you said, for the most part, this was 1 to 2 movies a year for the past decade. That's, even for, as you say, people who almost never go to the theater, that's a very manageable amount of movies to see, where you can still sort of say, okay, I'm on top of the Marvel universe, I'm keeping up with what's happening. Yeah, it may not be the most exciting thing to me, but I'll go and check out Ant-Man just because I'm curious to see what Marvel has to do with that.
Bought in, right? You're bought in.
Yeah, exactly. You're invested.
I mean, I'm hardly the first person to say this, but I think it's a lot like the way that television works. I think that these movies have gotten people invested in a sense that they're like, I think it becomes appointment viewing for a lot of people, where they're like, well, I have to see the next installment in the same way that I would press play on the next episode of a TV show. I'm invested in this larger story. I'm going to keep watching. And I just feel like that's something that not a lot of other cinematic universes, will say, have instilled in people, Yeah,
agreed.
And another thing I think that makes the Marvel Cinematic Universe similar to television is that a lot of the people's investment is in the characters. And that's something you see a lot. People will watch a TV show simply because they like a character. And people's identification with different Marvel heroes is really strong, I've noticed.
Yeah, big time. And I would say, actually, that the focus on characters is one of the stronger things about these movies. I think that very early on, it was decided that we are going to try to develop characters who have some degree of dimension. Obviously, Marvel was not the first. Was not the first company to say, let's make comic book movies with some personality. Obviously, the X-Men movies have plenty of that as well.
Sure.
But I think that Marvel, starting again with Iron Man, Marvel said that the draw for these films a lot of the time is the personalities, and finding characters that people like, that people find likable or funny or have specific points of view, and building the films around them.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. That these are people that you want to see. These aren't necessarily sort of archetypes that, in much the same way that, you want to know what James Bond's gotten himself into this time around. You get a similar thing with these Marvel movies.
Well, but Bond's a little different, though, because Bond, I feel like, in some respects, is just kind of an archetype. And, the various actors who have played Bond have kind of have put tweaks on that personality. There's not that. The Bond series never feels like a soap opera, in the sense that, let's find out what happened to this big family of characters that we're used to. The Bond movies are more about, here, variations on a theme. Here's something that you liked once. Every few years, we'll give you another version of it. Come back. You missed James Bond, right? It's been 3 to 4 years. Come see him again. The Marvel movies are more like, you got to keep watching, because you have to. you really got to see what's going to happen with Vision and the Scarlet Witch in this installment. You know,
I think that's very true. But I mean, again, maybe this speaks to Marvel's influence as a cultural juggernaut. But you see that even shifting with the last couple James Bond movies, which are very tied into each other and very much, sort of this ongoing narrative.
That's true. I mean, the Daniel Craig era James Bond movies have built on each other in a way that I feel like previous Bond movies didn't really, and that's probably one of the many aftershocks of. Even though I guess you could say that Marvel's hold over the industry and over the blockbuster system didn't really solidify until there had already been a couple of the Craig Bond films. But maybe as a culture, we were all moving towards that idea anyway, into serialized big screen entertainment.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think we are absolutely, as a culture as a whole, something that they've taken from Marvel is having the quippiness of Marvel movies has certainly permeated any action movie.
Yeah.
I mean, to be fair, Eddie Murphy was in action movies in the 80s. Marvel did not invent this, but it's such a signature of the series, like the famous falafel bit at the end of the Avengers.
Right. I mean, a lot of these movies are essentially comedies, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that ties a lot into their focus on character as well, and also into another what I see as a strength of this franchise, which is casting and performance. Success or failure of these movies creatively on an individual basis or on a whole, it's hard to argue that they've managed to secure a lot of pretty damn good actors to appear in them. Whether or not they're always using them to the best effect, I would argue that some of them are even wasted. This is a franchise that is built on its performances to some extent.
Yeah, I mean, that is true, and it's all fun, but also it's a little bit of a bummer to hear that an actor you like has been cast in a Marvel movie, because that means they're going to be thrown down a deep, dark well for the immediate future. They're not going to be in anything else for a while.
Yeah, Katie, I feel like you and I have talked about this before, about why it sort of bothers us when sort of promising filmmakers, for example, get sucked into this machine.
Yes, especially filmmakers.
Yeah, and Marvel's been doing that for years now, too, is finding interesting filmmakers, throwing some money at them, and putting them at the helm of these things. And while I appreciate the occasional accents these filmmakers bring to the projects, my fear is that a lot of the time when people go this deep Hollywood, when they start making movies of this size, they often don't go back. And I think that's kind of true. I mean, look at Downey, for example. I mean, Robert Downey Jr. obviously has had a lot of ups and downs in his career. He is obviously, he was a star, and then he was a disgraced star. And Iron Man helped bring him back, honestly, to a much greater level of stardom than beforehand.
Oh, much bigger than before, for sure.
But what has Downey used that capital on? I mean, has he made a lot of interesting films beyond the Marvel Cinematic Universe? Has he used his clout in the industry to get serious adult dramas made? Not really, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah.
He did it he did it maybe once with The Judge,
right?
Which was sort of a passion project for him. But I mean, I take your point there, and I understand I think you can argue maybe it's a little more true when you're saying somebody cast as maybe a hero as opposed to a villain, because the villain 90% of the time it's going to be a one-off thing. We don't need to worry too much about Cate Blanchett getting her schedule tied in knots for the next decade because of Marvel. But I also do think that to some degree that's also very much. I mean, I'm as happy to give Marvel shit as anybody else, but a lot of degree that's also on the performer. I mean, Chris Evans, for example, never stopped making small little weird, indie dramas. Like, he has a real soft spot, obviously, for like little human dramas that he's kept making in the interim in between all these Marvel films. So to some degree, it's just a choice of performer. And I don't get me wrong. I'm sure it's very easy to be seduced by Marvel size money, but nobody's agent is going to tell them no if they want to go direct if they want to go make a little movie.
That's true. There's an autonomy there. I just kind of I sometimes am skeptical of. No, I don't have a lot more to say to that. Honestly, that's a good point.
Well, I appreciate it when Chris Hemsworth steps away from the Thor desk and plays a hot idiot. I like when he does that. I enjoy his himbo roles.
Agreed.
So, I mean, I think the kind of strengths of this franchise are pretty self-evident in a lot of respects. I think that, I mean, I guess whether or not you find these movies funny is a matter entirely of perspective. I would say that I usually do, at least when they're trying to be, I think. I think that focus on character is something that's positive. I think they have strong casts generally. And in general, I would say that most of these movies, I mean, I in general, the Marvel movies strike me as pretty well-crafted product. And I do kind of mean that pejoratively in some respects. I just think that the Marvel movies are a little bit too relentlessly quality controlled in the corporate sense to ever allow for a lot of real artistic ambition.
This is one reason why I kind of prefer the DC movies, even though some of them I really hate. That some of them I really like. You know, I think it's more interesting to vary wildly in quality the way DC does than to be nothing but bees the way that Marvel is.
Yeah, I think, I mean, it sort of depends on what you're looking for, too, right? Because obviously, you know, as somebody who appreciates good cinema, as somebody who appreciates good film and interesting artists, I agree completely. But at the same time, I also very much see what, you know, Marvel's argument, which is, you know, you watch a Marvel movie the same reason you sit down, as you yourself, Dad, pointed out, to watch another episode of House or something, right? Where it's like, you know what you're going to get. It's comforting. It's enjoyable. It's with characters that you like and relate to. It's, you know, it's generally well written, well crafted. You never feel like you're being, you know, you never feel like it's being particularly stupid. It's playing to the top of its intelligence, even as it's maybe playing it entirely too safe for your tastes as somebody who likes good art.
Yeah, I mean, and I'll say this in Marvel's defense also. How often do comic books really stray from the same handful of plots?
Yeah, this is something that, all of this is coming right from the comic books. Like, even at, you know, people will talk about the great eras of, you know, the golden age, et cetera, of comic books. But even during that time, all of these artists and writers were under fairly strict controls. They were never going to kill off a popular character for good. They were never going to do some, you know, there wouldn't suddenly be a graphic sex scene in the middle of a Marvel comic book. Like, that's not going to happen.
Maybe nowadays, I don't know. I hear things are a lot wilder now. I don't keep up with comics anymore, but I hear it's a lot more varied than it used to be.
I mean, I guess if Punisher Warzone had been a big hit, Marvel Knights mini studio would have given you some spicy superhero sex.
Yeah. Okay. Can I air my biggest grievance with the Marvel Cinematic Universe right now?
Of course.
Please.
They look so boring. They all have 4 colors in them, and the last half an hour is just a blur of CGI. I hate the way these movies look. It is so boring to me.
Yeah, I mean, I think that has a lot to do with what critics have been calling for a few years now the kind of house style of the films. And I think it has a lot to do with the fact that a lot of the action in these movies are a lot of the action is orchestrated by a previs team, basically. That there are a number of people basically sitting down at a computer and deciding exactly how these action scenes are going to look. If rumors are to be believed, without a ton of input from the directors that are actually involved in the films.
I've heard that as well.
Yeah. Well, and not only that, but you look at the credits and you'll notice a recurring list of, for example, second unit directors, who are the people who are very often staging those big action scenes, at least to the degree that they're happening in real life. Right.
So they've kind of decided on a, but even that doesn't, I guess that doesn't totally excuse the fact that you're right, that the color palette in these movies is often quite drab. That
especially the Avengers ones.
Yeah. That the movies often take place, they'll set action scenes in extremely boring backdrops, you know. We'll get like, even, and we'll get to this later, but even maybe the best action sequence in this franchise is set against a boring airport tarmac, you know?
Yeah. and like some filmmakers, we were talking about interesting filmmakers being kind of absorbed into these things. Some filmmakers take to it better than others. Like, for example, Taika Waititi, his Thor movie that he made, I thought it was very funny, and he put his own kind of spin on their house comedy style, and that movie was more visually interesting than some of the other Marvel movies that I've seen. But like the Russo brothers, I just feel like whatever style they had is now completely just been subsumed by the Marvel House style.
It's just this muddy this muddiness and this general indifference to different textures, to different colors. Again, there are some slightly more colorful entries in this franchise, Thor Ragnarok being one of them. I'm glad you brought that one up, though, because I do think that's one of the better Marvel films and certainly one of the funnier ones. But that's also one where I feel like I can see the tension between an artist that has genuine ideas, maybe even a vision about what he wants to do, and the kind of demands that are put on this thing, which is another reason why I think it's hard to call these movies art, is that they feel like they are operating from a list of formulaic demands that they must meet. You know,
I think I think that's true, and I think even in arguably some of like the most visually inventive ones. For example, I think Doctor Strange, Scott Derrickson's contribution is a wonderfully inventive visual film.
It better be. It's Doctor Strange.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, part of that's built into the nature of the material itself, right?
Yeah.
He has a lot more. He had a lot more room to play around, given the nature of that character and how Doctor Strange works.
And its legacy in the comics.
Exactly.
Like all those psychedelic '60s Ditko comics.
Exactly.
From the 60s.
But as you say, even in that film, right, you can sort of see this where the seams are showing where there are sort of these mandated action scenes that are coming in where Derrickson sort of has to stop all the fun he's having with the sort of crazy wildness of the character and its universe and instead stage a fight scene.
It's not just a visual thing either. I mean, it very much has to do with the narrative these films can tell too, because they all do have to fit into this larger framework. And we've seen, I mean, filmmakers have come out since and talked about the struggles that they've had with Marvel about this kind of stuff. Joss Whedon famously had struggles with them after, I mean, obviously he directed the first Avengers film, which was an enormous hit, but then in the second one, he was sort of told, there are a number of things this movie has to do to progress this larger story it's telling. And you get these filmmakers who are sort of running into the imperative to fit this thing into the larger business model. Which, of course, I mean, the most obvious example of this, right, would be the Marvel movie that didn't happen, which is Edgar Wright's Ant-Man. Totally.
Which, where somebody talk about, I think even those of us who sometimes sigh when they hear of another, promising director sort of sucked into these giant corporate machines, I think everybody was pretty excited to see what an Edgar Wright Ant-Man movie would look like.
Oh, yeah.
And instead, he proved himself to be too much of an actual creative voice to go along with it, and they ended up firing him.
Yeah, I haven't... I don't know to what degree that's been aired, how much of that dirty laundry has been aired. I would be really curious to know exactly what Wright wanted to do that supposedly clashed with the Marvel suits and their vision of this movie, using vision very loosely in this case. I will say that there are clearly aspects of what he might have been doing with it in the movie. You can see elements of the film that seem vaguely Edgar Wright-ish. And honestly, I think that the version that we got is probably not radically different than the one we would have got had Wright stayed at the helm of the movie, because at a certain point, I do think that this is not a franchise that allows for a lot of genuine creative expression.
Yeah, like I brought it up earlier, I think Thor Ragnarok is the only one I saw where I felt like it was a real reflection of the work that I had seen this director do before.
Yeah.
I don't know if Taika Waititi is just like really good at negotiating with he can get through to the suits. I don't know what his special talent is that he's able to put his own personality into a Marvel movie. But I think out of all the ones that I've seen, his was the one that I felt the most like someone's vision to me.
I think there's a little here and there, I mean, I think that's one of the more pronounced ones. I think that, even if you want to talk about the Avengers movies, which I think are very televisual in appearance and occasionally rather drab in that respect, and either adhere or at least set the house style that Marvel follows a lot of the time. There's a lot of Whedon's personality and probably, unfortunately, his toxic work environments in that movie or in those films. But I think his sensibility is on them. I think that something like Black Panther has some of Ryan Coogler's sensibilities.
That's true.
Some of his thematic interests. But the fact of the matter is these filmmakers still feel like they're sort of taking those interests and finding a way to wedge them into the cracks of something that has been... that's been kind of shaped into formula from the start.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which again, like again, just to be a little bit of the contrarian here, right? Is something that a good journeyman director has always done. I mean, I think great directors have ones who are able to do that have always sort of appreciated the challenge of like, can I fit what I want to do into this mold? And if I can, great. Some people aren't cut out for it, but if you can do it, God bless.
Yeah, I mean that's sort of the Hollywood. There's a whole Hollywood tradition of that, right? Of filmmakers who worked in the golden age who managed to assert themselves even though they were acting in a pretty rigid studio system.
Exactly.
Well, the part that's frustrating to me is, yes, you have always had journeyman directors, and some of them are very, very good, but you didn't. But I think the difference is that Marvel seems intent on taking people who are not journeyman directors and like shoving them into that journeyman box almost as an act of dominance.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if they're hiring these people just to exert their dominance over them. I think they're probably, they're doing it in the hopes that they're picking somebody who does prove themselves willing to sort of compromise and work with a studio to sort of achieve what they want within that house style. I mean, I get the pessimism. Like, don't get me wrong. When would you ever doubt Hollywood's idea, attempt to ground out individuality? But at the same time, yeah, I think there's probably a little more wiggle room in there than we maybe sometimes give them credit for.
I would love to do an extended set visit on one of these movies, a sort of all-access one. I know that's something that I will probably never get to do in my career, but I would love to simply because I want to know what it really means to direct one of these movies. Because the stories that you hear about them and about what it means to make a Marvel movie and the degree to which there's these whole other teams. I mean, we talked about the pre-Viz team. We talked about second unit directors. There's all these moving parts. A Marvel production is even more so maybe than than any other movie. A Marvel production is the product of lots and lots of people working together on something. And when I hear stories of like Lucretia Martel, for example, she a few years ago spoke about getting approached by Marvel about the possibility of making a movie with them, and she said that I mean, I guess we'll take her on her word that this is how the conversation went, but she basically said that when she met with the suits at Marvel, they basically said, don't worry about the action scenes, we'll handle that. And she said, well, I mean, what if I want some say in the action scenes? So it leads me to wonder, like, what does directing one of these movies really amount to? Is it mostly just working with the actors? Is it about setting a tone in that respect? Because if you're not directly involved with the set pieces in the film, I don't know. I mean, maybe I'm being naive in that, and this is that's something that's true of a lot of Hollywood productions. But I've always thought of the director as being rather instrumental to how the action in an action movie might look.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and you also wonder how much of that, like, to what degree is there just sort of institutionalized sexism in terms of her experience there? To what degree that's how they treat everybody? Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of these days, once these directors who were in the first 3 waves of Marvel films are old enough to not give a shit anymore, it's going to be fascinating to hear them sit down and talk about what it was actually like making these movies.
I just want a full expose interview about that process,
I never thought about this before, but the Easy Riders Raging Bulls about this era is going to be super interesting.
Oh, wow.
Whatever that
or
comes
super
out.
depressing, maybe.
Yeah, possibly. It'll be Disney books, and there won't be a single negative word in it.
Exactly. Oh, Jesus. Yeah. I mean, I think for me, the fact that these things never feel like they can really be works of altruistic passion, that they ultimately end up feeling as much like the vision of a corporation as a filmmaker is what holds them back from greatness in a way that I think the really truly great comic book movies do. I mean, for me, this is not an opinion that has not been expressed multiple times. It's actually boringly generic to feel this way. But to me, I think the best comic book movies are probably The Dark Knight and Spider-Man 2. And both of those feel so much like every frame of those films feel like a product of their particular filmmaker's vision, Yeah,
I was going to say both of those guys come through very strongly in those movies.
Yeah.
Raimi and Nolan.
And the franchises that I've loved the most, even the long-running franchises that I've loved the most, are the ones that have empowered the filmmakers at their helm to kind of make the kind of movie they want to make. I mean, the two that I mention most often when I'm talking about this is the Alien films, which for a long time were basically like every movie in that series was different in accordance with the person who was at the top of them. Obviously, that gets complicated when you think about something like Alien 3, which has David Fincher, and he's disowned the movie and talked about his battles with the studios. But nonetheless, at least those first 4 films are so distinct because they feel like they were made by individuals, not a corporation. And I also think about the Mission Impossible movies, which I know I bring up fucking every episode of this podcast. but the Mission Impossible movies, at least until McQuarrie basically took over and became the person who's now making all of them, those felt, I mean, you would never confuse De Palma's Mission Impossible movie for Brad Bird's, because though they are operating also by a certain formula, just like the Marvel movies, they also feel like they are catered to the particular interests of their filmmakers.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's very true, and that sort of speaks to what you're saying here. But I mean, I think it also sort of ties in though to you're also talking about 2 other franchises where they're very much about these sort of self-contained films in a way, right? Where there's not these post-credit stingers that have become the norm now. There's none of that sort of sense of, what's the next one going to be? It's each of these movies ended as though that's the last we're ever going to hear from those people. And that, and I think that speaks to another of what you find to be the weaknesses of these, the Marvel films, right? The MCU, which is problems with sense of closure.
Yeah, they're never self-contained. I mean, they always, I mean, you could argue that that's a strength in some respects because it's just a different form of storytelling, that people are looking for different things from the Marvel movies. They like the fact that each movie sort of bleeds into the next. But I've felt honestly, since almost the very start of this franchise, I've sort of felt like these movies were always selling me more fun down the road, I remember watching Thor, the first Thor, and thinking like, okay, this thing almost seems to exist in order to introduce these characters into this world. It has its own pleasures to some extent, but it does feel, in its own way, like a bit of a placeholder. And the Marvel movies, I felt like for so many years, were just saying, stick around, there's going to be more fun next summer. And it always felt like they were always looking forward until they got to Endgame, obviously, in 2019. And when we got to that one, I just kind of felt like we finally got to the end of the line, and that movie spent a bunch of its runtime looking back on previous installments.
Yeah, which you disliked, I guess.
Well, I will say that some of the stuff, some of the Back to the Future, like we're playing around in footage of the previous movies, is really fun to me because I like time travel nonsense. But yeah, at the same time, it felt like, can these things ever exist? Could they ever possibly exist as their own thing? Could they ever possibly be their own movie with a beginning and an end, and they feel satisfying on their own? I guess that's comic book storytelling for you at its heart, I suppose. But I will say that the comic books that have meant the most to me over the years are the ones that, even if they're part of a larger whole, have some sort of value as an individual work as well.
Mm.
I think that's true. I will say though, I think that's something that maybe you see to a degree with some of the better Marvel films, which is that, as you're saying, like, this is the nature of the medium. This is comic books. This is comic book movies. The one bleeds naturally from the other, where it's about the ongoing. This is never really over. But that doesn't mean you can't have, good punctuation, right? Sort of good endpoints. And you'll have the ones that do that, I think. For example, the first Captain America movie, right? Mm-hmm. Yes, it ends with this sort of, he wakes up and it's the future and now he's going to be a man out of time. But that movie in and of itself, I mean, that to me is almost beside the point. That movie is a very nice, I think, self-contained story about a man becoming a hero. And, the better Marvel movies, I think, do this, where that you know it's going to continue, but you still get good punctuation that leaves you feeling like that movie in and itself did everything it needed to do.
But it can't be self-contained. I mean, the very ending that you're talking about, like a successful movie, I think. I mean, I'm not one of those people who thinks that a mediocre ending can ruin a film, and I actually do enjoy the first Avenger for what it is and for a lot of what you're talking about. But it's not like we can pretend that the movie doesn't end that way. And it's also not like you could just lob off that stay tuned until the Avengers part at the end. You have to if the movie just ended with him going in the ice, that's not an ending. Like it by design, it cannot have a sense of narrative closure that I think most of the great movies that have been made have some degree of at least temporary finality to them.
That phrase "temporary finality" I think already speaks to sort of the conflict inherent in what we're sort of maybe to a certain degree disagreeing about, but also agreeing about, because temporary finality by definition is this sort of, it's Star Wars, the Empire Strikes Back. It's always that, and it doesn't mean greatness can't be in there.
But when Michael Corleone shuts the door at the end of The Godfather, yes, there's more Godfather to come. I'm afraid I don't know the history of that franchise well enough to know if they were already planning to do a part 2. But the fact of the matter is that operates perfectly well, as you could look at the end of that film and say, The Godfather is a whole. I don't have to accept anything afterwards. I don't have to, if I didn't want to, I could say that 2 and 3 don't exist, because it exists in a way, it's not an ellipses at the end of the film,
I was going to say that Star Wars works quite well as a standalone film, too.
Yeah.
The original 1977 one.
Yeah,
they win at the end, and there's a medal ceremony.
Yeah.
There is no ellipses. Like, they win. Spoiler if you've never seen Star Wars, I guess.
But of course, Empire does not. I mean, and Empire has a deliberate to be continued ending, and I think that most people argue that Empire is the better film, and I think I probably agree. But yeah, I mean, maybe a lot of this goes back to that ultimately. That, like, if we were willing to accept an ending that was basically just stay tuned until next time, I mean, no wonder we are where we are.
Yeah, it is very comic booky to do that. I will say that.
And I think, you're getting as close as you're going to get to what you're talking about you sort of want here with Endgame, which, as you say, for maybe you didn't like to some degree, the film was just sort of a victory lap through the past 10 years of stories and payoff for people who have been watching it since the beginning, but is also very much an ending. There's no moving forward with Iron Man. There's no moving forward. Like, there was no post-credit scene for come back next time for more exciting Avengers adventures.
Right.
We have finished telling this story.
I did like that. I will say we'll see about that, but I think if the money's right, we might suddenly see Tony Stark back in action. Well,
they have said that they're not going to recast Black Panther. That Chadwick Boseman's death. Yeah, that's it for that one.
Well, then there is some finality there, because there sort of has to be some finality there.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. The interesting thing about that is it feels like T'Challa did not get a proper ending, because by necessity, he did not get one, because of course they were planning on him being involved in future installments. So while Evans and Downey both got to have the hero edit, so to speak, Boseman's story would just sort of sadly cut off at the knees,
Yeah. Yeah.
But so I want to talk a little bit about the current state of the MCU and what we see as its future, because it's good that we sort of got to Endgame, because I think that Endgame does reflect a turning point for this franchise. And the pandemic, I think, has slowed down the degree to which I think if we were having this if COVID had not happened and we were having this conversation on this day, 2021, without that, I think we would be talking about, we'd be having a very different conversation. But the fact of the matter is that because movie theaters closed and because Marvel pushed all these products back, we sort of are still in that sort of lingering post-Endgame status quo, I guess I'd say, where the notion of where this franchise might go next in a larger sense is still kind of up in the air, right?
Yeah, to a large degree, I think, especially for audience. I mean, I think Marvel has a very clear sense of what they want to be doing in the coming years. But for audiences who sort of saw Endgame and saw that as the conclusion of the story, and even if you knew the next movie that was coming out was Black Widow, I mean, sorry, spoiler alert, if you've seen Endgame, you knew that wasn't exactly the continuing saga of Natasha Romanoff.
Exactly.
You knew that was a flashback story, and that where it went after this was sort of anyone's guess.
Yeah, I'm just curious, like, are we going to see a huge crossover event again? Is Marvel going to build this thing up again? Say we get new characters and suddenly we're moving towards more Avengers movies or to another large scale event? Or will Marvel for a little while allow these things to be, at least to some degree, a little more self-contained? I'm genuinely curious. Like, is Eternals just going to be a setup for future Marvel movies, or is it going to be its own thing?
Yeah, it's a good question, right? I mean, to me, the closest comparison to something like Eternals would be obviously the Guardians of the Galaxy, which even when it first came out, I remember people were wondering, oh, this seems like such a standalone thing. These characters can't really interact with the rest of the Marvel universe. Is it going to be Marvel's first flop? It certainly was not. But B, how are they going to integrate that? And it took sort of the, massive mechanics of the Infinity War story to be able to sort of bring those characters together with the Avengers and the heroes that we know. So, I could see very easily the first couple Eternals movies or something like that, building this sort of separate space story, much like Guardians of the Galaxy did with their first two films, before somehow being integrated.
I think the bigger question here is, how long will audience interest in these characters stay at the level that it is now?
I'm super curious about that too. I think that this year, it's going to be really interesting. I'm looking forward to seeing what the returns are going to be on these movies that they're putting out there. I think they're going to do well. I have a theory actually that the pandemic may actually have. If the bubble is going to burst on comic book cinema and on Marvel specifically, I actually think the pandemic may have delayed that happening. Because I
completely agree.
I think it created a hunger for these things that audiences used to get at a very steady clip every few months, and then they basically have gone 2 years without seeing another big one, and I think that that is going to sustain the franchise for at least a little while longer, as people are like, oh shit, I get to see my old friends again, or man, it was really hard not having one of these things for a couple years. Here's four.
Yeah. That's what makes me the 2 years followed by 4 movies in 1 year is what makes me wonder, what's going to happen, if that's going to intensify or over people's interest, or if it's going to oversaturate and they're going to get burnout. I'm very curious, because it could be one or the other. I really can't say.
Yeah, I think one of the big the thing is, there's actually a couple of big variables here that also are genuinely storytelling related, which is behind the scenes machinations of Disney and Marvel's acquisition of 20th Century Fox, right? Because there's an entire other franchise out there waiting to be integrated back into the Marvel Cinematic Universe from where its comic book origins began, and that is the X-Men.
Yeah.
X-Men, the last couple X-Men movies have seen profoundly diminishing returns, to the point that the last one was just an outright flop. But I think the excitement, and especially for comic book fans, excitement about the idea of that being returned to it. So what I think a lot of people say is its rightful place in the Marvel universe would be a big deal that could also help stave off the bubble bursting.
Like when they brought Spider-Man into the MCU, that was a huge deal.
Yeah. And people accepted it immediately. People did not say, oh, wait, we just had another Spider-Man movie a few years ago. It was a version of Spider-Man that people wanted. So people were like, yeah, we'll accept that there's another Spider-Man now, sure.
Exactly.
I think one thing that it's good to remember, too, is that, we are all critics and entertainment writers. And when there's a Marvel movie out, it dominates our industry. It dominates the type of pieces that we have to write. It dominates the conversation. These movies loom over our jobs, one could say, over our livelihoods. Sure. But for the average person, that's not necessarily true, obviously. A Marvel movie is something fun that they go see, that they like, and then they go on with their lives. It's not tied up into what their daily, what they do professionally necessarily. So I think that we get burnt out on these things faster, maybe a little faster than the general public does.
I think that's probably fair.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so should we do some superlatives? Should we talk about some of our...
Yeah, I was going to say, I'm curious to hear what you guys have to say.
Yeah.
It's a nice way to end, yeah.
I am curious to hear what you guys have to say about some of these superlatives about best and worst in the Marvel Universe. So I'm gonna tee you guys off.
Great.
So first of all, Dowd.
Yes.
Who is the best villain in a Marvel MCU movie, in your opinion?
There's a lot of bad ones to choose from, honestly. But I guess we'll get to that in a minute. But I think the best of this franchise is Killmonger, the character that Michael B. Jordan plays in Black Panther. And I think that has a lot to do with him having a philosophy that's borderline persuasive, if not more than borderline.
Don't they do that a lot in Marvel movies, you know, like have a character who you're the villain where you're like, yeah, maybe that guy is right. And then they have him kill somebody or something, so they're back on the villain side. It's not something that they do a lot.
Well, for sure. And I think you could argue that Black Panther's politics are actually not great in terms of the way that it ends up dismissing this character's genuine philosophy about the world and about...
hey, he's not wrong.
Right. You know, that maybe we should be using these resources to help black people around the world, you know. So I think it's the Magneto principle in some respects. One of the reasons I thought Magneto is such a great villain is that there are days when if he's mad, then his madness sounds an awful lot like good sense. I think some of the great comic book villains are the ones where you can see yourself being seduced by their worldview, and I think that they make Killmonger an enormously both Jordan and writer-director Ryan Coogler make Killmonger such a sympathetic character in a lot of ways that I really don't think that there's almost nobody else like him in the whole franchise. It was actually a very easy call for me, to be honest.
Yeah, and I have seen Black Panther, of course, and I thought that having that playoff between Killmonger and T'Challa gave the movie a lot of pathos. I thought. Yeah,
and some genuine, and this is something that's not true of Marvel all the time, but some genuine ideological stakes. You know,
Yeah,
like a villain that actually challenges the way that the lead character thinks about the world. I think that's just something this franchise doesn't do that often with its various boring intergalactic conquerors, you know. So yeah, Killmonger definitely my pick.
Okay, speaking of seduction, Mcleavey, what's yours?
Yeah, I mean, I love Jordan's performance as Killmonger. It's probably my second favorite, but I would go with Loki, Tom Hiddleston's Loki. I originally would say in Avengers, but actually I think it's a bit of a cheat here when I say this, right? Because it's the one villain that Marvel hit on that really popped to such a degree, and because Hiddleston's performance is so good that he sort of goes through the redemption arc over the course of the three phases of 10 years of Marvel movies. He goes from this sort of genuinely sort of standard issue tragic Shakespearean figure in the first Thor movie, which is not a great movie, but I think he does a really good job sort of bringing some soul and nuance to a character that I think we all recognize from real life, which is the insecure jerk who always feels like he's living in the shadow of his more successful sibling, and the fact that they were able to take that and sort of stretch it out and turn it into this genuinely interesting redemption arc over the course of 3 Thor movies, and sort of give him, make him in some ways a comic relief figure, almost even towards the later stuff, and especially with now the new series Loki, but give him some turn his genuine pathos into something that they keep pulling new interesting angles and aspects of his personality out of over the course of these movies. So again, yeah, a bit of a cheat because it takes multiple movies to get there, but still my favorite villain.
That's a strong performance and a strong character in this franchise. And I have liked that the movies have managed to, over the years, give him glimmers of humanity and of compassion even, and really developed this complicated relationship he has with his brother without necessarily tossing out the window the fact that he's a shithead and that he's a selfish liar. And can I ask, what have you thought of the Loki TV series?
I've really quite enjoyed it. I think, at this point, I'd be hard-pressed to say which of the two, I mean, we only have 3 options thus far to choose from of the, Disney Plus's Marvel shows. But Loki is the first one, I think, that has really sort of nailed a sense of grandeur and scope, and that sort of old-school, Jim Starlin, Katie referenced the 70s artists at Marvel. But it's the first one that's really sort of, I think, brought that into the small screen in a tangible way that made it feel as vibrant and thrilling as some of the bigger, more, I find, engrossing Marvel big screen movies.
What I know about Loki is that a lot of people I follow on Twitter post very thirsty posts about him. That's what I know about Loki. Can I say something, though, not to get mired in the negative, but something that I don't really like that Marvel does is apparently now they're cracking down on people who write about Thor and Loki in the sort of Norse mythology sense. They're trying to put proprietary rights on mythological characters, which I don't which I don't approve of. Yeah, they shut down all these Etsy sellers that were selling, like Thor and Loki, merchandise, and they meant it in a Norse pagan kind of way.
That's despicable.
They didn't mean it in a Marvel kind of way.
That's horseshit.
That's fucking despicable.
Like those characters existed long ago.
You can't copyright Norse gods, for fuck's sake. Or maybe you can.
Yeah.
You shouldn't,
I don't appreciate that aspect of it.
Yeah.
All right. So, speaking of negativity, we all touched on this in a kind of negative way earlier, but I'd be curious what y'all's best action scene is. And Dowd, you said yours takes place in kind of an ugly location.
Yeah, my favorite action scene in the MCU, I think, is still the superhero on superhero brawl that happens in Captain America: Civil War, when you have sort of half the Avengers fighting the other half, and they're all kind of trying not to hurt each other, but they're on opposing sides of this struggle, and some of them with Captain America, the rest of them with Iron Man. I thought that is one of the few times that this franchise has actually captured the excitement, the big splash panel excitement of an action scene that you'd find in a comic book, where they're really managing all these different characters in a really smart way. We're getting tons of really fun, entertaining collisions of not just personalities, but of the various powers these characters have. It's very clear that when the Russos set out to make this one, they thought about, how would these different characters' skill sets engage with each other. It's just one of the most it's one of the more purely entertaining action scenes, I think, in all of comic books, honestly. And I can forgive the fact that it takes place on a generic concrete slab. The very boring backdrop for it, but I can forgive that.
What about you, Mcleavey? What do you think?
I completely agree about what makes that fight sequence so great. For me, though, I have to say that when it comes to just purely looking at an action sequence for the sake of action, I think Captain America: The Winter Soldier is the best of these films, and I think in particular the elevator fight sequence in Winter Soldier is just something we hadn't seen in a Marvel movie before, and honestly for the most part since, which is just this intense like old school hand-to-hand kinetic fight combat, incredibly well choreographed, incredibly well done, tense, filmed, in these great close-ups where you still get a sense of the choreography of anything that's going on. It doesn't just look like a mush of bodies. That movie, the opening fight on the ship with Batroc, Captain America versus Batroc, sort of gives you the sense that, that movie is going to do something different, that this is very sort of gritty, almost like what the great DTV action directors were doing at the time, or about half a decade earlier. And it really, everything about it is just thrilling to me. I could watch that elevator fight over and over.
Awesome.
Yeah, I don't think it's an accident that Frank Grillo is in The Winter Soldier. I think his sort of, DTV action royalty, Frank Grillo. He plays Crossbones in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Yeah, I agree that sequence is. I got to be boring and agree with you, just as you just agreed with me. It's a great action sequence, and I think The Winter Soldier in general keeps the action practical and legible. And there's plenty of CGI in the film, but a lot of it is very physical in a way that these movies aren't always, and I really appreciate that about it as well.
I appreciate that too. I appreciate that about an action film. I really like it when you can kind of really feel the impact of the punches in an action scene. So
totally.
And that's of course with somebody who then falls 6 stories out of the window of the elevator and lands on the ground, and yet it still felt somewhat real.
What about, okay, so we also talked about how the characters and the actors who play them are a big part of the appeal of the MCU, but what's the best performance from one of these actors, do you think? Let's do Mcleavey first.
All right, so performance, that's a tough one, right? Because with so many of these characters you're dealing with, as I mentioned with my favorite villain, Loki, you're dealing with performances in a role that goes from movie to movie, and these characters change and evolve in different ways. But for me, if we're singling out a single standalone movie, I find Robert Downey Jr.'s performance in Civil War to be to be something quite profound, actually. You know, he's so good in that first Iron Man, and he so establishes sort of the parameters of that character, that to then see what happens to him in Civil War, where he sort of goes the opposite way. I mean, that's a character who very much, each film, it feels like the character is, and the performance is reacting to what he did and what happened in the previous film that we saw him in. And so to be greeted in Civil War with these sort of very human, and for us, for the first time, really dealing with his family and who he was growing up and how this worked, you know, in a really profound way, I think makes his performance there really great. That being said, I also very much just enjoy Paul Rudd's dumb swashbuckler in Ant-Man.
What do you think, Dowd?
It's hard to beat Downey, although I might focus more on the first film. But I think that is such a terrific movie star performance in that first movie, and just the amount of charm he brings to that role, the amount of charm and smarm, the way that he's able to sort of telegraph a change of heart that this character is going through without losing that sardonic spark of personality. I think it's a really great movie star performance. But I would also look to the Guardians of the Galaxy films, which I think have really strong performances almost across the board. I'm really fond of Bradley Cooper's voice work in that. I really like. Yeah. I think Dave Bautista is hilarious in those movies. As this kind of deadpan knucklehead. But if I'm going to single out one person, it might be Karen Gillan, honestly. And I think, like Hiddleston, she is afforded an arc for her character, and I think that she does a really good job of playing somebody in those movies who is very, very hardened to the world, but finds her sort of cracks developing in this kind of warrior's cynicism that's developed over the years. And again, it's another sibling relationship, just like the one between Thor and Loki, but I think it's handled really well in the Guardians films, to the point where I think she actually has one of the stronger through lines of character work in the last two Avengers movies, especially Endgame, which is such a decentralized spectacle in that we're following dozens of characters. But I feel like Gillan is there giving this an emotional underpinning, even as she's playing a character who is kind of hard to read emotionally sometimes.
You know, I do very much enjoy the kind of tone, the comedic tone, and the needle drop aspect of the Guardians of the Galaxy movies. I find those movies to be quite lively and entertaining. But speaking of, what is the funniest Marvel movie in your opinion, Dowd?
Probably Ragnarok, honestly.
Yeah, that was really funny too.
Yeah. Is anybody going to disagree about that?
Probably not.
Not me. I mean, I haven't seen all of them, but I think it's the funniest one.
I mean, it's definitely trying the hardest to be funny too, in some respects. I mean, humor has been an aspect of this franchise since the start, as we mentioned. But Ragnarok is the one that pushes it almost to the point of parody at times.
Right.
You know. But there's some really, really strong bits in it. I especially like, to just single out just one of them, I really like how Thor keeps trying to play both the Hulk and Bruce Banner, telling each of them that he prefers them to the other person inside of them. Yeah, that's some very good gags in that. Also, obviously, Jeff Goldblum, just being Goldblum, but I'm not going to complain about that, you know.
Wouldn't you just be Goldblum if you were Jeff Goldblum?
Yes, I would.
I mean, I would. Now, I said we weren't going to dwell on negativity, but I honestly want to know what each of you guys think is the worst of these movies.
This is a boring answer, but I got to go with Iron Man 2.
I have seen that one. It was not very good.
No, it's not. And it's not even that it's without pleasure. I mean, I actually really quite like Sam Rockwell's sort of what if Tony Stark was just a selfish asshole with no conscience. I sort of like his performance in that film. But Iron Man 2 feels like a victory lap in a lot of respects, and it also feels like that kind of shagginess that made the first one so fun really runs amok in the second one, where you're just like, what movie are you even trying to tell here? You know, like, or what story are you really trying to tell here? Like, what is this movie? It just feels like a monument to its own excess in a lot of ways. And also, I will say that is one of the least graceful ones in terms of working in the franchise pushing things forward, mythology, the stuff in that's because at that point also there's this whole thing about how Downey wasn't. I don't think at that point Marvel had secured Downey's involvement in the Avengers yet. But the movie still needs to serve as a setup for the Avengers. So we get a scene where Samuel L. Jackson's Nick Fury comes and talks to Robert Downey Jr. and talks to Tony Stark about the Avengers initiative, but he can't say, we want you to be involved, because at that point they weren't sure he was going to be involved. It's just rarely do the strings show as much as they do in that second movie.
Yeah, I have to agree with that. I think there's so much that's just sort of bloated and over the top about Iron Man 2. You know, yeah, it's really sort of trying to revel in its own awesomeness in a way that really it's just a bad look for the character, for the story, all of it. I will say Thor 2, The Dark World, I think comes close, just in terms of another movie that very much just feels like it exists only to service franchise obligations. I have a little more fondness maybe for it because I think its ending fight scene has a little more pop and inventiveness to it. I really enjoy this sort of, Thor and fighting Malekith, and they're just sort of tumbling through dimensions and worlds. And I actually quite liked that part of it. I thought that was that in and of itself, I think, is a quite good sequence. But the rest of the movie before it is just so weak.
Yeah, that's not a. that one basically feels like boilerplate to me, honestly. Like, we were like, okay, well, we need a second Thor movie, so we'll do this. I don't think it's without its pleasures, to be honest, and I don't think it's worse than Iron Man 2. But the villain that's like the weakest villain in the history of this franchise. Like, he is, good luck. I had to look up his name even, and it's Lee Pace, and talk about taking an actor who's pretty good and has been very good in other things and just reducing him to, here, put on some fucking elf ears,
Yeah.
No, you're thinking Christopher Eccleston.
Oh, well, there you go. Pace. See, I just fucked it up. I confused them. Yeah. We're not cutting this. I want this to remain. You're right. It's Christopher Eccleston. Lee Pace plays the bad guy in Guardians of the Galaxy, who is, for all intents and purposes, basically the same character. I mean, he's just a humorless intergalactic conqueror, and they're totally interchangeable, I think.
Yeah, a zealot with no justification for their zealotry.
Right, exactly.
What about the best of all of them?
I think the best of this franchise is Captain America: The Winter Soldier. I've always really liked this one, and I think a big part of it is that it handles all of the juggling that's involved with making one of these movies and what it has to be. It handles all of that with a fair amount of grace. I mean, it's 100% a middle chapter in this franchise. I mean, it's looking both back and forward.
Sure,
it understands its place in the middle of this thing, and yet it feels more than a lot of these entries like its own movie, and it feels like one where they're having fun for the sake of the fun they can have, both with the action, which we talked about earlier. It's more practical than a lot of what we see in these movies, but also with the dynamics between these characters. I really like that they sort of pair Captain America off with a bunch of. It's sort of like a buddy comedy where he's got a few different buddies. It's like he's. Obviously it introduces Anthony Mackie's the Falcon, but there's also Scarlett Johansson's Black Widow is in this one as well. It's not as quippy necessarily as some of the other entries in this franchise, but it is genuinely funny, I think. And I think at its core, you have a performance by Chris Evans that grounds this thing in a kind of relatable conflict, somebody trying to find their place in a world and in a political culture that they don't recognize.
Mm-hmm. Now, my, this is not a definitive best, obviously, but my personal favorite of the ones that I've seen was Black Panther, because it has all that kind of character work that you're talking about, and that heft, and it's very Shakespearean.
Yes.
Black Panther, and that's what I like about it.
Black Panther is excellent too. For sure.
Yeah, Black Panther does Shakespeare in a way that the first couple Thors wishes it had done.
Didn't Kenneth Branagh make those too?
He made the first one, yeah.
Yeah, that's right. But what's your best though, Mcleavey?
I mean, I don't think it's a coincidence that with a lot of these, we're sort of coming down in very similar ways. I definitely see your case for Captain America: The Winter Soldier, and on another day, I might go with it. But personally, I think I do have to go with the first Avengers film. That to me is sort of the platonic ideal of what you want in like a sort of a superhero team-up movie. I'm so impressed with how, efficiently and effectively it sort of reintroduces all of these characters that we met before in previous movies and brings them in to join each other in a way that, it doesn't feel tiresome. It doesn't feel like we're just rehashing what we already know. It gives them all dynamics to play off, and then basically turns into a film that's all about them actually having to work as a team, as opposed to just being like, all right, we're all together now, let's go fight a giant, hole in the sky.
Sure.
Even though, of course, there is a giant hole in the sky. But yeah, that's I really just admire it for this sort of seemingly impossible task it has, that it feels like it pulls off very effortlessly when you're watching it.
That's all we've got time for this week. Thanks again to Alex McLevy, staff writer at the AV Club and music editor at the AV Club, for being our guest this week. You can find him on Twitter at AlexM247. And while you're at it, please be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to Film Club wherever you get your podcasts.
This week's episode of Film Club was hosted by me, Alex Dowd, and by Katie Rife. It was produced and edited by Carl Blomberg. Our sound mixer and finishing editor is Zach Goldsboro, and our motion graphics designer is Julie Mullins. If you'd like to hear our thoughts on Black Widow, the new Marvel movie, there's a very special bonus episode out today as well. And we'll be back next week with a brand new episode talking about the best films and performances of the year so far. Thanks, folks.
See you then.